November 1943, somewhere outside Palermo, Sicily. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein sat in a commandeered farmhouse poring over intelligence reports his analysts had compiled on the American Third Army. Bayerlein was meticulous. He had served under Rommel in North Africa. He understood men. He understood armies. And what his analysts were telling him about General George S. Patton made sense until one report stopped him cold. The Americans, his intelligence officers confirmed, had a serious problem inside their own ranks. Not with the enemy. With themselves. A network of soldiers, white soldiers, were actively sabotaging the performance of Negro units attached to their formations. Racial hostility, intimidation, deliberate equipment failures. It was the kind of internal fracture that, in Bayerlein's professional judgment, should have been crippling. Divided armies lose. That was doctrine. That was history. That was fact. Bayerlein folded the report carefully and set it aside. He expected this American problem to solve itself in Germany's favor. He was wrong. What Patton did next wasn't in any intelligence file Bayerlein ever received. And what it produced on the battlefield would cost the Wehrmacht dearly. To understand what George Patton faced, you have to understand the United States Army of 1943. It was not one army. It was two, operating under the same flag, wearing the same uniform, saluting the same regulations, and separated by a racial policy so rigid it had its own official name. Army Regulation 21010 mandated racial segregation across all military installations, units, and assignments. Negro soldiers trained separately, ate separately, fought separately, and were commanded, almost universally, by white officers who had been selected, in many cases, specifically because they held views compatible with maintaining that separation. The Buffalo Soldiers of the 92nd Infantry Division were among these segregated formations. They carried a lineage stretching back to 1866, through the Indian Wars, through Cuba, through the Argonne Forest in 1918. They had bled for a country that would not let them drink from the same water fountain as the men they fought beside. By 1943, they were preparing to fight again in the European theater, where American military doctrine said they would perform a supporting role. Limited in responsibility, limited in expectation, limited in command authority. The Ku Klux Klan had been actively recruiting within U.S. Army installations since at least 1942. FBI reports, later declassified, confirmed organized Klan cells in at least 14 stateside bases. The poison had crossed the Atlantic. And when Patton assumed command of the 7th Army in Sicily, July 1943, he inherited not just soldiers. He inherited that poison. He did not intend to keep it. What Patton discovered was not a rumor. It was documented. It was systematic. And it was, by any military standard, an act of treason against unit cohesion in a combat theater. Sergeants and junior officers, white, had been deliberately withholding ammunition resupply information from Negro quartermaster units. Equipment maintenance on vehicles assigned to integrated work details was being sabotaged. Spark plugs pulled, fuel lines loosened. In at least 2 confirmed incidents, white soldiers had beaten Negro soldiers, who had been recommended for commendation. The beatings were designed to send a message. Perform too well and you will suffer for it. Patton's G2 intelligence section identified the core of the problem in early November 1943. A loose cell of between 12 and 20 soldiers spread across 2 regiments with confirmed ties to organized Klan activity back in Georgia and Mississippi. They were not hiding their beliefs. One sergeant had been openly wearing a Klan membership card in his breast pocket. He apparently believed no officer would dare move against him. That belief reflected a reasonable reading of the U.S. Army's institutional history. From 1866 through 1942, white officers who harassed, demoted, or physically harmed Negro soldiers faced no meaningful consequence. The system had absorbed it. Commanders had looked away. Courts-martial had been rare. Convictions rarer still. What this cell had miscalculated was the specific identity of the commander now reading those G2 reports. George Patton was many things. Patient was not among them. Patton had a complicated relationship with race. One that his biographers have spent decades attempting to parse honestly. He believed, with genuine conviction, that the performance of Negro soldiers in previous American wars had been constrained not by inherent limitation, but by the deliberate suppression of their officers and institutions. He had studied the Buffalo Soldiers. He had read the after-action reports from the 369th Infantry in the First World War. The Harlem Hellfighters, who had fought under French command precisely because French officers were willing to treat them as soldiers rather than liabilities. The 369th had received the Croix de Guerre. They had never surrendered a foot of trench. Their performance had not been explained away quietly. It had been documented, honored, and then systematically ignored by the American military establishment that brought them home. Patton understood what ignored capability looked like. He found it professionally offensive. On November 11, 1943, Armistice Day, a date Patton would have chosen deliberately, he convened a formal command review at his Palermo headquarters. He summoned the regimental commanders under whose authority the identified soldiers served. He placed the G2 documentation on the table. He did not raise his voice. Witnesses later described it as the quietest dressing down they had ever seen Patton deliver. And they found the quiet more frightening than the screaming. Patton told his commanders three things. First, that every soldier in an American uniform was an asset of the United States government, and that damaging a government asset in a combat theater was a criminal offense under the Articles of War. Second, that any soldier found to have deliberately impaired the combat readiness of any unit, regardless of that unit's racial composition, would be court-martialed, stripped of rank, and remanded military prison. Third, that any commander who had known about these activities and failed to report them would be relieved of command that same afternoon, without appeal. 2 colonels were reassigned within 72 hours. The 12 soldiers at the core of the cell faced formal charges under Article 96 of the Articles of War. Conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline. 9 were convicted. 3 received sentences of 6 months hard labor. The sergeant with the Klan card in his breast pocket received 18 months. But Patton did not stop there. That was the part Bayerlane's intelligence never captured. Patton understood that punishment alone does not rebuild what sabotage destroys. The Negro quartermaster and support units that had been systematically undermined were operating at degraded readiness, not because of their own failure, but because they had been made to fail. Equipment was substandard. Supply chains had been manipulated. Morale had been corroded by months of documented hostility. Patton ordered a full readiness audit of every Negro unit operating under his command. The audit took 11 days. What it found was not a broken force. What it found was a capable force that had been deliberately hobbled and was, despite everything, still functioning at between 60 and 75% of its potential operational capacity. Without the sabotage, Patton's logistics, officers calculated, those units could have been operating at 90+% within 3 weeks of sustained proper support. 3 weeks. In Sicily, 3 weeks was the difference between a pursuit and a siege. Patton reassigned white officers from the implicated units and replaced them with officers who had requested Negro command assignments. A list, it turned out, that was longer than anyone in the War Department had acknowledged. He authorized accelerated promotion reviews for Negro NCOs who had been passed over. He visited the quartermaster units personally, not for a morale speech, but to inspect equipment, ask technical questions, and demonstrate that soldiers always understand better than words, that their commander knew what they did and considered it worth his time. One soldier who was present at that inspection, Corporal James Weston of the 3668th Quartermaster Truck Company, recalled decades later that Patton examined the undercarriage of a 2.5-ton cargo truck for nearly 4 minutes, found a hairline crack in the rear axle housing, and told the motorpool sergeant, a Negro staff sergeant named Robert Holloway, that he wanted that vehicle red tagged, and the mechanic who had missed the crack identified and retrained, not punished. Patton told Holloway that a good mechanic who makes one mistake is more valuable than a mediocre mechanic who never makes any because the good mechanic learns. Holloway remembered those words for the rest of his life. What Bayerline's intelligence apparatus never understood was that Patton's intervention produced a military asset that the Wehrmacht had not calculated into its operational planning. By late January 1944, the logistics backbone supporting American operations in Italy was running with a precision that German supply officers found, frankly, baffling. The 92nd Infantry Division and the attached quartermaster, engineering, and signal units that had been degraded by clan sabotage were now performing at levels that confounded German after-action analysts. Their read on the American Negro soldier, informed by decades of American propaganda that had seeped even into Wehrmacht intelligence assessments, was that these formations were unreliable, prone to collapse under pressure, and manageable if you hit them hard and fast. The Germans hit them hard at the Arno River line in the summer of 1944. They did not get what they expected. On August 24, 1944, elements of the 370th Infantry Regiment, part of the 92nd Division, crossed the Arno under direct German fire near the town of Lucca. German defensive positions had been established with the assumption that Negro infantry, if pressed aggressively, would break and fall back. This was not a casual assessment. It was a formal tactical doctrine derived from German intelligence evaluations of American unit performance in prior engagements. Evaluations that had been based, in part, on the artificially degraded performance numbers produced during the period of clan sabotage. The 370th did not break. They took the crossing point. They held it under 3 German counterattacks in the following 18 hours. The third counterattack involved armor, 2 Panzer IV tanks and a self-propelled gun, and the 370th knocked out the self-propelled gun with a bazooka team and forced the Panzer IVs to withdraw when flanking fire from a 2nd Rifle Company threatened to cut off their retreat route. German casualties in those 18 hours numbered 41 killed and an estimated 90 wounded. American casualties were 23 killed and 67 wounded. The German battalion commander, Major Heinrich Voss, filed a report on August 26 that his divisional headquarters initially refused to credit. Voss wrote, in part, that the American infantry at the Arno crossing had demonstrated tactical flexibility, fire discipline, and unit cohesion inconsistent with prior assessments of their capability. He recommended an immediate upward revision of the threat evaluation for all Negro American formations in the Italian theater. His recommendation was filed. It was not acted upon quickly enough. The tactical assumption that Negro soldiers were a manageable second-tier threat persisted in German operational planning through late 1944. Each time German forces in Italy encountered the 92nd Division expecting a soft target, they paid a price for that expectation. The compounding cost of that miscalculation in men, in material, in strategic miscalculation cannot be precisely quantified. But German operational records from the Italian theater, reviewed by military historian Carlo D'Este in his exhaustive postwar analysis, confirm a recurring pattern. Units briefed that they faced Negro formations consistently underestimated resistance and suffered disproportionate casualties in the opening phase of engagement. Patton's decision in November 1943 had, without anyone fully recognizing it at the time, turned a German intelligence asset into a German liability. Every false assessment the Wehrmacht made about Negro American capability had been built on data corrupted by American racial sabotage. When Patton destroyed the sabotage network, he destroyed the foundation of the German estimate. The Germans kept using the estimate. They just didn't know the foundation was gone. The statistical record supports this conclusion at every level. The 92nd Infantry Division logged 2,848 battle casualties in the Italian campaign. 313 killed in action, 1,240 wounded, the remainder missing or captured. Those numbers represent a formation that fought. Units that break don't accumulate those casualty profiles. They accumulate route statistics, men captured en masse, equipment abandoned, intact, positions surrendered without contest. The 92nd's profile is the profile of sustained engagement, not collapse. The 3668th Quartermaster Truck Company, Robert Holloway's unit, the one Patton had personally inspected, logged 96,000 vehicle miles in the 3 months following Patton's readiness audit against a pre-audit baseline of 61,000 miles in the previous comparable period. That is a 57% increase in operational output from the same unit, with the same men on the same roads. The variable that changed was the elimination of deliberate sabotage, and the restoration of proper equipment maintenance and command support. Post-war testimony from German officers who served in Italy consistently reflects the surprise element. Generalmajor Max Simon, captured in 1945 and interviewed by American military historians, stated that German tactical assumptions about American Negro formations had been systematically incorrect, and that his units had paid in blood for assessments we should have revised sooner. Simon did not know why his assessments had been wrong. He did not know about the Klan cells or Patton's November intervention. He knew only that the soldiers he faced had not behaved as his intelligence told him they would. Patton himself never publicized what he had done. There was no press release, no speech, no entry in the official command diary that explicitly connected his anti-Klan action to battlefield performance. He treated it as what it was, a command and discipline problem that he had solved as he solved all command and discipline problems, with speed, clarity, and zero tolerance for interference with military readiness. Here is the counterintuitive truth at the center of this story. The conventional narrative of American military racial integration frames it as a moral struggle, which it was. But inside that moral struggle lived a military logic that was equally absolute. Patton did not act in November 1943 primarily because of moral conviction. Though the record suggests he found racial sabotage genuinely contemptible. He acted because sabotage is sabotage. Because degraded readiness costs lives. The lives of the men being sabotaged, yes. But also the lives of every soldier whose flank depended on a supply line. That wasn't running or a signal unit. That was operating at 60% or an infantry regiment whose morale had been corroded before it ever reached the front. The Klan cells in Patton's command believed they were protecting something. What they were actually doing was handing the Wehrmacht a free intelligence advantage, a false picture of American capability that German commanders would rely on to their own destruction. Patton took that gift back. The principle that emerges is not complicated. Capability suppressed is capability surrendered to your enemy. Any institution, any organization, any team that deliberately degrades its own members for reasons unrelated to performance is not protecting itself. It is weakening itself, and somewhere across the line, the enemy is reading that weakness into their calculations. Patton understood this. The Wehrmacht eventually did, too. The lesson cost them 41 men at a river crossing near Lucca. It cost them more elsewhere, and it began with one American general who looked at his G2 report in November 1943. And decided that no uniform in his army would be treated as the enemy while he was in command. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to the channel.